welcome to a new episode of EU Decoded, the podcast by the EPP Group in the European Parliament, where we break down key political and social issues. Well, today we're tackling a difficult but urgent topic. How can Europe better protect children from sexual abuse? The European Parliament recently adopted its position on a recast of a law to combat child sexual abuse, a law that urgently needs updating, especially in light of how new technologies are changing the landscape. So for this episode, we spoke to several MEPs and child protection experts to understand the main obstacles to fighting these crimes and what Europe can do better. The statistics are alarming. Child sexual abuse is on the rise offline, but especially online as children spend more time on the internet. Jeroen, the MEP who authored the Parliament's report, sees this as a clear warning and a call for action.
This should be a huge warning. The amount of alerts we see for child sexual abuse material online throughout the world is skyrocketing. We also see more and more new technological advancement in, for instance, artificial intelligence, which also has an impact on child sexual abuse material. So all this together really means that there's an urgent need to revise this legislation in order to protect our children better, both offline and online.
Stronger protection isn't just important, it's urgently needed. Fuchs from the organisation ECPAT International, the largest network of civil society organisations dedicated to ending the sexual exploitation of children, says Europe is facing an unprecedented crisis, one that's growing rapidly in both obscenity and severity.
1 in 5 children is subject to sexual violence and abuse, and this is not confined to any one background. Children from all backgrounds, cultural, social, economical backgrounds are affected by it, and they face abuse in various environments and countries. Online, actually, the scale and severity and violence of child sexual abuse is out of control. We have over half of young people today who say that they have experienced sexual harm online during their childhood. To give you a sense of the volume, in 2023 alone, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children has received 36.2 million reports, which included 100 million images and videos of child sexual abuse. So that means that every second, 3 images or videos were shared online. And what is even more worrying is that 98% of these images involve children that were younger than 13 years old.
And this brings us to another serious concern, AI-generated child sexual abuse material. Hannah Swirsky from the Internet Watch Foundation says this type of content is skyrocketing, with offenders creating imagery that is increasingly realistic and more extreme. The IWF reports a 400% increase in web pages showing AI-generated child sexual abuse between January and June of this year compared to the same period in 2024.
So we're seeing a real increase in the amount of imagery that's available that's being AI generated. It's also important to note that AI videos of child sexual abuse have absolutely skyrocketed. So we discovered 1,286 compared to just 2 in the same period last year. We're also warning for the first time that actually AI CSAM videos have crossed the threshold and they have really become indistinguishable from photographic sexual abuse. It's also really important to recognise that this imagery can be produced at an astonishing scale and speed. So, for example, a single prompt can generate at least 50 different images, and this could take as little as 20 seconds to create. So this technology is widely available. It's accessible, to almost anyone to create really profoundly harmful content behind closed doors.
The EPP Group fully supports the criminalisation of AI-generated child sexual abuse material, both the tools used to create it and the content itself. Because when it comes to child abuse, there's no such thing as a victimless image. MEP Jeroen Lenaers explains why.
For us, it's important that in all EU member states, AI-generated child sexual abuse material is criminalized in exactly the same way as real child sexual abuse material. The problem is that some could argue, but when it's AI, it's fake. So there are no actual victims involved. And I think this is a wrong approach for 2 reasons. One, these AI models that create this child sexual abuse material, they need to train. And they can only train on real child sexual abuse material, so on real abuse of children. Secondly, we know from many researchers, from many investigations, that using AI-generated child sexual abuse material is only a very small step to moving towards real sexual abuse of children. And these are two reasons why we say child sexual abuse material generated by artificial intelligence should be criminalized in exactly the same way as real abuse material. And we should also at the same time make sure that those who create, build, sell, produce, use these AI tools should be criminalized in exactly the same way as well.
Hannah Swirsky from the Internet Watch Foundation warns that this kind of content can have dangerous ripple effects, both online and offline.
Research has also shown a link between viewing CSAM and committing content offences. So a study of the dark web by Finland's Protect Children revealed that 40% of offenders said they would seek contact with a child after viewing any form of CSAM. So that includes AI-generated CSAM.
In other words, the line between virtual and physical abuse is dangerously thin.
So it's really important that every country outlaws AI-generated child sexual abuse material and treats it in the same way as other forms of child sexual abuse material. And we're extremely concerned by the fact that we don't have a harmonisation of laws and a coordinated approach currently. So at IWF, we strongly welcome the European Parliament's clear stance, which would criminalise AI-generated CSAM in all circumstances.
This kind of material, whether AI-generated or not, is showing up on digital platforms. And very quickly, the problem becomes transnational. So where's the accountability? Right now, many of these platforms simply don't have adequate safeguards in place to stop child sexual abuse material from being uploaded in the first place. MEP Jeroen Lenaers says the updated legislation will address that issue as well.
This is the legislation which sort of harmonizes the criminal codes of the member states to fight the abusers. At the same time, talks are ongoing about the regulation, which also helps scan, for instance, and detect child sexual abuse material online, where there is a huge responsibility for platforms to also do more.
It's clear that platforms need to take more accountability. Some organisations, like the Internet Watch Foundation, offer them tools to help detect and remove child sexual abuse content. Hannah Swirsky highlighted the need for more companies to engage with these efforts.
Tech companies must prioritise protection of children, and there are a number of ways in which they can do this, such as through rigorous model testing, implementing safety by design as well, and also ensuring that the models are tested and assessed before they are opened out, so that they do not have the capabilities to generate CSAM. There's a number of ways in which they can do that, and there is guidance available. So the tools are there, and it really is up to the AI companies themselves to ensure that they are doing this.
Well, another major change in this new law is the proposal to remove the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. Right now, if too much time passes before charges are filed, the abuser may never be prosecuted. But for many survivors, especially children, due to fear and trauma, it can take years, even decades, to speak out about what happened to them.
We see even that the average age in which I do that is way, way beyond, like around 50 years old. Half of the victims comes to terms and files charges around the age of 53. Now, if you're a child, you're abused at the age of 7, and there's a limitation period of 20 years, it means that you would have to have pressed charges by the age of 27, which simply doesn't happen, or only very rarely. Our logic is, for something as gruesome as child sexual abuse, there should be no statute of limitations. There should be no deadline, no clock running for the victim to get justice. A victim of child sexual abuse should always be able to get justice.
The EPP Group is pushing for the full abolition of time limits on prosecuting child sexual abuse, because justice shouldn't come with an expiration date. If survivors carry the trauma for life, then justice must remain possible for life too. Fuchs from ECPAT International shares this view. She says the law must reflect how long it truly takes for many victims to come forward.
So statute of limitations means a time limit by which you can prosecute a child sexual abuse offender. They are different across EU member states, across countries in the world. And what they do is that they create legal barriers for survivors to seek justice and compensation. But in a way, they also protect offenders. Once the limit has passed, they cannot be prosecuted anymore. We have launched a campaign called Timeless Justice, where we call for the abolition of these arbitrary time limits. And we highly welcome the historic vote of the Parliament last month on this. And we actually called the Council and the Member States to take this momentum forward and ensure access to justice regardless of time. Because we know for many reasons, a lot of survivors do not come forward, well, never for some, or very late, and so then they cannot seek justice because they have been through that time limit. And we know it can be for several reasons, from trauma, fear, shame, and also mistrust in the institutions that sometimes were there to protect them in the first place, or that they feel also that they might be re-victimized in the process.
So abolishing the statute of limitations is an important step forward. But it can't help those who never come forward to report abuse. And that's why creating a victim-centred environment is crucial, where survivors receive care and support at every stage.
One of the big changes we have made in the Parliament compared to the Commission proposal is that we really have focused also on creating sort of a victim-friendly environment, let me put it like that, to make sure that authorities, and I talk about all authorities in the member states, that a victim encounters during the stages of being a victim, whether they receive medical care, whether they receive psychological care, whether they are in touch with police or with justice or with child protection services, that all these authorities are coordinated and they all adopt an approach really from the perspective of the victim. We have the so-called Barnehus model, which is an exemplary model to deal with victims of child sexual abuse. And of course, we're not forcing member states to adopt this model, but we do tell them to have this principle at least in mind when they implement legislation like this, because it's extremely important for victims.
Julie Fuchs from ECPAT International explained this Barnehus model.
Barnehus means children's house in Icelandic. This is a child-centered model. The process is simple but effective. It's basically that instead of having to move the child from a place to another, having to retell the story over and over again, be re-victimized in the process, everyone comes to them. It's just under one roof, so they will speak to one person that will listen to what happened to them, but also in a way that makes it better for the child to really explain what happened to them.
The updated legislation will also address the issue of consent. Right now, EU member states have different legal ages of consent, and for the EPP Group, it's important to establish a clear, common definition. That means recognising that consent, of course, can't be given when someone is afraid or intoxicated, and what's considered consent in one country shouldn't be treated differently in another. But there's another layer to this: protecting victims who are over the legal age of consent. Without clear rules, abusers can exploit legal grey areas and escape accountability.
We have abolished the idea that the punishment for abusing a child which has reached the age of legal consent should be lower than when you abuse a child under the age of legal consent. Because abuse is abuse, and whether you could have consented or not should have no impact whatsoever on the fact that you didn't consent. It's abuse and it should be treated as such.
Now, it's not because a child is over the age of sexual consent that it can consent to whatever situations. There are many factors to take into account, so from imbalances of power, manipulation, trauma, fear, emotional development that have to be taken into account. And it's not because the child is above that age limit that suddenly they're less worthy of protection or that it's safer for them in some way. That's why it's important to have an affirmative consent approach, one that relies on a clear, explicit, and voluntary yes that is taken into account in the surrounding circumstances. Because when you have imbalances of power, the consent is genuinely impossible. And when we speak of consent, we really speak of consent between peers, peers being individuals close in age, maturity, and development.
Another concern is just how easily children can access adult content online. Some reports show that the average age of first exposure to pornography is between 9 and 11, but in many cases, it happens as early as 5 or 6 years old. MEP Francois Bellamy has pushed for stricter age verification on platforms that host adult content. He argues that early exposure to this kind of imagery can deeply affect a child's understanding of affection, love, and healthy sexual relationships.
It is an assault on the psychological integrity of children, and we can't let this go every day, every minute in our countries as if it would be normal. This is the core business model of those platforms that is at stake, and is the reason why they refuse to put in place these technical measures, because they want to create addiction, and to create addiction also in the next generation. We need to put an end to this, because so much is at stake. Psychological development of the next generation, protection of children, because this is also leading to violence also among children, and protecting children against sexual violence implies also to stop this sadly incitative effect that pornography is having even in very young minors. But also, finally, this is about the image that this generation is building of itself, image especially of women, young women. We know how destroying this is for the representations that they have of themselves. And I think it is now our duty as a European Union to end this vulnerability that the European law is creating around member states that are willing to act.
Well, the psychological and social impact is clear, but so is the need for stronger regulation. Hannah Swirsky says platforms that host adult content must take real steps to prevent children from accessing it, and that basic age checks are not nearly enough.
Research has indicated that viewing pornography among youths is associated, or can be sometimes associated, with harmful sexual behaviours, and indeed the consumption of sometimes violent pornography by children is increasingly being linked to the growing rates of sexual violence against girls and young women. So it's really important that platforms take steps. If they host pornography on their platforms, they must take steps to stop children from accessing their websites. Allowing someone to tick a box to say they're 18 is not enough. And we do know that tools exist that are privacy preserving to enable age assurance. Also ensuring that we have a minimization of data that needs to be inputted, and it's done in a useful way. For example, if you have digital IDs, that could be a useful way of certifying your age, in the same way that someone needs to provide their proof of their age when they're buying alcohol.
The idea of privacy-preserving age verification is already a reality in other sectors. MEP Francois Bellamy says the same standards should apply when it comes to protecting children from online pornography. If platforms can verify IDs to rent scooters, then they can do the same to restrict access to adult content.
It's not up to the legislator to decide on the technical aspect of these measures, but those measures exist, and we perfectly know how to put this in place. If I want to, with an application, to rent an electric scooter in the streets of Brussels, this application will ask me to show my ID and to show my driving license. So we perfectly know how to identify a user in any kind of application, website or content. We need to do exactly the same when it's about adult content. Of course, it's not about identifying the people who are accessing to this content. It should be, of course, fully respected that this is about private life, but simply verifying that you're an adult, that you have a right to access to it.
The scale and complexity of child sexual abuse demand a coordinated and urgent response. From abolishing statute of limitations to holding platforms accountable and addressing AI-generated abuse material, the EPP Group is calling for laws that reflect today's realities. The goal is clear: better protection of children and fewer gaps for abusers to exploit. Well, this was EU Decoded, a podcast by the EPP Group in the European Parliament. Thank you for listening.